When we think about the lives that have shaped history, we often look to kings and emperors, philosophers and generals. But sometimes the most profound stories come from the most unlikely places. Sometimes they emerge from the dusty streets of forgotten villages, from the calloused hands of working men, from hearts that have been broken and rebuilt again and again. Today we're diving into one such story. A story that begins with failure and ends with triumph. A story about a man who would deny everything he claimed to believe, only to become the very foundation upon which an entire movement would be built. This is the story of a fisherman who became a rock, a coward who became a hero, a man who reminds us that our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths. His name was Simon, though history would know him by another name entirely. He was born into a world that seemed determined to crush the spirits of ordinary people. The year was approximately 1 BC, and the small fishing village of Bethsaida sat precariously on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. This wasn't some peaceful lakeside community. This was a place where two worlds collided violently every single day. You see, Bethsaida straddled the border between Jewish and Gentile territories. It was precisely this strategic location that made it valuable to the Roman Empire. They had transformed what might have been a quiet fishing village into a bustling imperial outpost. Roman soldiers walked the same streets as Jewish fishermen. Greek merchants haggled in the same markets where Hebrew prayers were whispered. It was a powder keg of cultural tension, religious friction, and political oppression. Into this volatile world, Simon was born. His father was a man named Jonah, and the family business was fishing. But this wasn't the romanticised version of fishing we might imagine today. This was backbreaking, dangerous work that demanded everything from a man's body and soul. The boats were small, the nets were heavy, and the sea was unforgiving. More than that, fishing in first-century Palestine was an industry controlled entirely by Rome. Every catch was taxed, every boat was regulated, every fisherman was viewed with suspicion by the authorities. You see, many Romans considered fishermen to be little more than thieves. There's a reason why centuries later a Roman writer would lump fishermen together with money launderers, murderers, and common criminals. When your daily catch went wrong, you didn't just have a bad day. You had to explain to Roman officials why you were essentially stealing from the empire. The pressure was enormous. The stakes were life and death, and there was no easy way out. This was the world that shaped young Simon's character. From his earliest days, he learned that survival meant being tough, being quick with his words, and yes, sometimes being quick with his fists. In a place where Roman authority clashed with Jewish tradition, where economic survival hung by a thread, where every day brought new challenges and new dangers, Simon developed the kind of personality that would either save him or destroy him. He was impulsive. He was passionate. He was the kind of man who spoke first and thought later, who acted on instinct rather than careful consideration. These traits would serve him well in the dangerous world of first-century fishing, but they would also lead him into some of the most painful moments of his life. Around the age of 25, Simon married a woman from his hometown. Soon after, driven by the demands of the Roman fishing industry and the need to provide for his growing family, he made the decision to relocate to Capernaum, a much larger and more prosperous port town on the Sea of Galilee. This move wasn't just about economics, it was about survival. Capernaum was where the real money was, where the fishing industry was most developed, where a man could potentially build something for his family. Simon packed up his life, brought his wife and children, and started over in a new place. But he didn't go alone. His brother Andrew came with him, as did their fishing partners James and John, along with their father Zebedee. This wasn't just a family business anymore. This was a network of relationships, a web of connections that would prove crucial in the years to come. It was around 27 AD when everything began to change. Word started spreading throughout the region about a new religious movement taking place on the banks of the Jordan River. It was like nothing anyone had seen before. Picture an American tent revival, but with the intensity and passion that only comes from people who have been oppressed for generations. Israelites from all over the region were making pilgrimages to see this phenomenon. Tax collectors, fishermen, Pharisees, Roman guards, merchants, labourers. People who normally hated each other, who had spent their entire lives in conflict, were all drawn to the same place by the same message. The movement was led by a man called John the Baptist, and his message was revolutionary in ways that most people today can barely comprehend. You see, in the ancient world, baptism was almost exclusively reserved for Gentiles who wanted to convert to Judaism. It was how outsiders joined the family of Abraham. It was how foreigners became part of God's chosen people. But John's message was radically different. He was telling everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, that they needed to be baptized. He was saying that everyone was so desperately fallen, so completely in need of God's righteousness, that no one could claim to be righteous on their own. Everyone needed to be washed clean. Everyone needed to start over. This was scandalous. This was dangerous. This was the kind of message that could get a man killed. But it was also incredibly powerful because it spoke to something deep in the human heart. It spoke to the universal need for redemption, for a fresh start, for hope in the midst of despair. Andrew, Simon's brother, was completely captivated by this message. He joined the movement full-time, leaving Simon, James and John to manage the fishing business on their own. For Simon, this must have been frustrating. Here was his brother abandoning the family business to follow some religious teacher, leaving the rest of them to pick up the pieces. But Simon's frustration was about to turn into something much more profound, something that would change not just his life, but the course of human history itself. One day, a man came from Nazareth to be baptized by John. This wasn't unusual in itself. People came from all over to be baptized. But something was different about this man. When John saw him approaching, he said something that made everyone stop and pay attention. "Behold," John said, "the Lamb of God." 2 of John's disciples heard this and immediately began following the man from Nazareth. One of those disciples was Andrew. The other would later become one of the most important figures in Christian history. But at that moment, they were just 2 men who had heard something in John's voice that made them believe they were witnessing something extraordinary. Andrew spent time with this man, listening to his teachings, watching his interactions with others. What he heard and saw convinced him that John the Baptist was right. This wasn't just another teacher. This wasn't just another religious leader. This was something unprecedented. Filled with excitement and certainty, Andrew rushed back to find his brother Simon. The conversation that followed would echo through the centuries. "We have found the Messiah," Andrew told Simon. These weren't words spoken lightly. These weren't words spoken casually. In the context of first-century Palestine, under Roman occupation, in a world where hope was often the only thing people had left, these words carried the weight of centuries of expectation. Simon must have felt a mixture of emotions. Excitement, certainly. His brother had found the one they had all been waiting for. But also uncertainty. What did this mean for him? What did this mean for his family, his business, his carefully constructed life? The answer came just a few days later. Simon and Andrew were out on the Sea of Galilee, doing what they had always done, casting their nets and hoping for a good catch. The work was hard, the results were uncertain, and the pressure from Roman authorities was constant. It was just another day in the life of a first-century fisherman, but then they saw him. The man from Nazareth was teaching on the shoreline, and a crowd was gathering. Simon and Andrew could hear his voice carrying across the water, could see the people pressing in to get closer. And then, unexpectedly, the teacher approached their boat. He asked if he could use their boat as a platform to teach from. This wasn't an unusual request. Teachers often used boats to address crowds on the shore. The water provided natural amplification, and the boat kept the teacher from being overwhelmed by the crowd. Simon agreed, probably more out of politeness than genuine interest. But as he listened to the man teach, something began to stir in his heart. The words were different. The authority was different. This wasn't like the other teachers he had heard. When the teaching was finished, the man from Nazareth made a suggestion that, from a practical standpoint, made no sense at all. He told Simon to put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon's response reveals everything we need to know about his character at this point in his life. He was practical, he was experienced, he had been fishing these waters his entire life, and he knew that this wasn't the right time or the right place for a good catch. "Master," he said, "we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." But then he added something that would prove to be prophetic. "But because you say so, I will let down the nets." What happened next defied everything Simon thought he knew about fishing, about the sea, about the natural order of things. The nets filled with so many fish that they began to break. Simon had to signal to his partners in another boat to come and help. Both boats were filled to the point where they began to sink. This wasn't just a good catch, this wasn't just luck, this was a miracle, and Simon knew it. His response was immediate and instinctive. He fell to his knees in front of the man from Nazareth and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." It was in that moment of recognition, in that moment of overwhelming awareness of his own unworthiness, that Simon's life changed forever. Because the man from Nazareth looked at him with eyes full of compassion and said, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will catch men." And then, in a moment that would be remembered for thousands of years, the teacher gave Simon a new name. "You are Simon, son of John," he said, "but you will be called Peter." Peter, the rock, the foundation, the man who would become the cornerstone of a movement that would transform the world. But at that moment, Simon Peter couldn't have imagined what lay ahead. He couldn't have foreseen the miracles he would witness, the failures he would experience, the redemption he would find. All he knew was that his life had just taken a turn that could never be reversed. He left everything. His business, his security, his carefully planned future. He left it all to follow a man who had shown him that the impossible was possible, that the ordinary could become extraordinary, that a simple fisherman could become something he had never dared to dream. This was just the beginning. The real story of Peter, the story of transformation and failure and ultimate triumph, was just getting started. But already in this first encounter, we can see the seeds of everything that would follow. We can see the impulsive faith that would lead him to walk on water, and the human weakness that would lead him to deny his master. We can see the recognition of his own sinfulness, and the acceptance of grace that would enable him to become the rock upon which the early church would be built. Peter's story is remarkable not because he was perfect, but because he was so perfectly human. He was a man of contradictions, a man of great faith and great failure, a man who would discover that sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths when they are surrendered to something greater than ourselves. The fisherman was about to become a fisher of men. The sinner was about to become a saint. The rock was about to be tested by storms that would either break him or make him stronger than he had ever imagined possible. And in his story, we find our own. Because Peter's journey from failure to faith, from weakness to strength, from fear to courage, is the journey that all of us are called to take. It's the journey that reminds us that no matter how far we fall, no matter how badly we fail, no matter how unworthy we feel, there is always hope for redemption, always possibility for transformation, always a chance to become more than we ever thought possible. Now, continuing from where we left off, Peter's real education was just beginning. You see, being called as a fisher of men was one thing, but understanding what that actually meant, well, that was something entirely different. And this is where we begin to see the beautiful complexity of Peter's character unfold in ways that should both challenge and comfort every single one of us. The first thing you have to understand about Peter's new life with Jesus is that everything he thought he knew about power, about leadership, about what it meant to follow God, was about to be turned completely upside down. Remember, this is a man who had spent his entire life under the thumb of Roman occupation. He had watched his people suffer, watched his family struggle to make ends meet under crushing taxation, watched his fellow Jews bow their heads in submission to foreign rulers who worshipped foreign gods. So when Jesus began performing miracles, when Peter witnessed the water turn to wine at Cana, when he saw his own mother-in-law healed from a fever that would have likely killed her, when he watched Jesus command the very elements of creation itself, Peter's mind must have been racing with possibilities. Finally, here was someone with real power. Here was someone who could stand up to Rome. Here was the revolution he had been waiting for his entire life. But then Jesus started talking about love. He started talking about forgiveness. He started talking about turning the other cheek and loving your enemies and blessing those who curse you. And Peter, this rough-hewn fisherman who had learned to survive by fighting for everything he had, must have wondered what kind of revolution this was supposed to be. This tension comes to a head in one of the most famous passages in all of Scripture. Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him the usual answers. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But then Jesus makes it personal. He looks directly at them and asks, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter, in a moment of divine revelation, declares, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." This is the moment that changes everything. This is the moment when Peter moves from being a follower to being a leader, from being a disciple to being the rock upon which Christ will build his church. But here's what's so profound about this moment. Jesus doesn't just affirm Peter's declaration, he gives him a new identity. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Think about what's happening here. This fisherman, this man who couldn't even read or write according to the religious leaders of his day. This man who was considered by the educated elite to be nothing more than an ignorant peasant is being told that he is the foundation stone of the greatest movement in human history. The church that would spread to every corner of the earth, that would survive the fall of empires, that would endure through centuries of persecution and triumph, that would bring hope to billions of souls across thousands of years, was going to be built on the confession of faith that came from the lips of a simple fisherman. But Peter's story is not just about triumph. It's about the messy, complicated, often painful process of transformation that every single one of us goes through when we decide to follow Jesus. Because immediately after this moment of revelation, immediately after Jesus declares Peter to be the rock, we see Peter stumble in the most dramatic way possible. Jesus begins to tell his disciples about his coming suffering and death. He explains that he must go to Jerusalem, that he must suffer at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, that he must be killed and on the third day be raised. And Peter, the same Peter who had just declared Jesus to be the Christ, takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him. "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." And Jesus' response is swift and severe. "Get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Can you imagine the whiplash Peter must have felt? One moment he's being called the rock, the foundation of the church, blessed by the Father in heaven. The next moment he's being called Satan, a hindrance, someone who is thinking like a man instead of like God. This is the Peter we all recognize, isn't it? The Peter who gets it gloriously right one moment and spectacularly wrong the next. But this is exactly why Peter's story is so important for us. Because Peter represents every single one of us who has ever tried to follow Jesus. He represents the reality that transformation is not a one-time event, but a lifelong process. He represents the truth that God doesn't wait for us to get our act together before he uses us. He represents the hope that our failures, our stumbles, our moments of weakness and doubt are not the end of the story, but part of the story. And Jesus knows this. Jesus knows that Peter is going to fail. Jesus knows that Peter is going to deny him 3 times on the night of his arrest. Jesus knows that Peter is going to run away when things get difficult. Jesus knows that Peter is going to doubt and fear and struggle. And Jesus chooses him anyway. This is what we see in the Transfiguration. Peter, along with James and John, is taken up onto a high mountain where Jesus is transfigured before them. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become white as light, and Moses and Elijah appear and talk with him. And Peter, in his typical fashion, doesn't know what to say. He offers to build 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And while he's still speaking, a cloud overshadows them, and a voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." This moment is crucial for Peter's development because it gives him a glimpse of who Jesus really is. Not just a great teacher or a powerful miracle worker, but the Son of God himself, the one who stands in the presence of the Father, the one who is approved and beloved by heaven itself. This vision will sustain Peter through the dark days ahead, when everything seems to fall apart, when his master is arrested and crucified, when his own faith wavers and fails. But the real test comes at the end, in the Garden of Gethsemane and the courtyard of the high priest. Jesus has been arrested, and Peter follows at a distance. When he's confronted by a servant girl who recognizes him as one of Jesus' disciples, he denies it. When he's confronted again, he denies it again. And when he's confronted a 3rd time, he begins to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crows, and Jesus, being led away by his captors, turns and looks at Peter. And Peter remembers the words of Jesus, how he had said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. This is Peter's lowest moment. This is the moment when all of his boasting, all of his promises of loyalty, all of his declarations of faith crumble into dust. This is the moment when he realizes that he is not the rock he thought he was, but just another weak, frightened, fallible human being who cannot even stand up for the man he claims to love when it matters most. But this is not the end of Peter's story. This is not even the beginning of the end, because 3 days later, Jesus rises from the dead, and Peter's real transformation begins. Not the transformation that comes from success and strength, but the transformation that comes from failure and forgiveness, from brokenness and restoration, from death and resurrection. This is the Peter we need to understand. Not the Peter who walked on water, but the Peter who sank beneath the waves. Not the Peter who declared Jesus to be the Christ, but the Peter who denied ever knowing him. Not the Peter who was called the Rock, but the Peter who crumbled under pressure. Because it's in this Peter that we see ourselves, and it's in this Peter that we see the incredible grace and mercy of God. The resurrection changes everything for Peter. When the women come running from the tomb with news that Jesus is alive, Peter runs to see for himself. When Jesus appears to the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Peter jumps into the water to swim to him. When Jesus asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Peter answers 3 times, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And each time Jesus gives him a commission: "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep." This is the restoration of Peter. This is the moment when his failures are redeemed, when his denials are forgiven, when his weakness is transformed into strength. Not because he has somehow become a better person, but because he has encountered the risen Christ, because he has experienced the power of God's grace, because he has learned that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Now, the transformation that began with Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi was about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. You see, declaring Jesus as the Christ in a moment of divine revelation was one thing, but living out that confession when the world turned upside down was something else entirely. Following his restoration by the Sea of Galilee, Peter found himself standing on the Mount of Olives watching Jesus ascend into heaven. This wasn't just another goodbye. This was the moment when everything Peter thought he knew about leadership, about ministry, about being a disciple, was about to be redefined. The man who had walked on water, who had cut off a soldier's ear, who had denied his Lord 3 times, was now being entrusted with something far greater than he had ever comprehended. 10 days later, everything changed. The sound of a rushing wind filled the upper room where Peter and the other disciples were gathered. Tongues of fire appeared and rested on each of them. The Holy Spirit had come, and with it a boldness that Peter had never experienced before. This wasn't the impulsive courage that had led him to swing a sword in Gethsemane. This was something different. This was divine empowerment. When Peter stood up that day at Pentecost, he wasn't the same fisherman who had panicked in a courtyard. He addressed the crowd with an authority that came from beyond himself. 3,000 people were added to the church that day. Not because of Peter's eloquence, not because of his education, but because the Spirit of God was working through a man who had finally learned to depend on something greater than his own strength. But here's what's remarkable about Peter's transformation. It wasn't instant. It wasn't a flip of a switch. Even after Pentecost, we see Peter struggling with the same issues that had plagued him before. When Paul confronted him in Galatia for withdrawing from the Gentile believers, we see that Peter was still learning, still growing, still being shaped by the grace of God. This is where Peter's story becomes so profoundly encouraging for us. You see, we often think that spiritual maturity means we stop making mistakes, that we reach some point where we no longer struggle with our old patterns. But Peter's life shows us something different. It shows us that transformation is a process, not a destination. It shows us that God doesn't wait for us to be perfect before He uses us. He uses us in our brokenness, through our weaknesses, despite our failures. Think about it. Peter's greatest sermon came just weeks after his greatest failure. His most powerful ministry emerged from his deepest shame. The keys to the kingdom were given to a man who had locked himself out through his own cowardice. This isn't coincidence. This is grace. This is how God works. The early church needed Peter's particular kind of leadership. They needed someone who understood failure, someone who knew what it meant to fall and be restored. When Peter wrote his letters to the scattered churches, his words carried the weight of experience. When he told them about suffering, he knew what he was talking about. When he wrote about the grace of God, he wasn't speaking theoretically. He was writing from the depths of his own encounter with divine mercy. Peter's ministry in those early years was marked by signs and wonders. People were healed by his shadow. He raised the dead. He opened the door for the Gentiles to enter the kingdom. But perhaps his greatest miracle was simply this: he kept going. After the denials, after the failures, after the moments when he must have wondered if he was qualified for anything, he kept going. This is the Peter we need to understand. Not the superhuman apostle of legend, but the broken fisherman who discovered that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Not the man who never stumbled, but the man who learned to get back up every time he fell. Not the disciple who had it all figured out, but the follower who was willing to keep learning, keep growing, keep being transformed by the grace of God. Peter's story reminds us that our past doesn't disqualify us from our future. Our failures don't define our potential. Our weaknesses don't limit God's power. In fact, they may be the very things that make us most useful to Him. Because a Peter who had never denied Jesus might never have understood the depths of divine forgiveness. A Peter who had never failed might never have been able to restore others who had fallen. The church that Peter helped establish wasn't built on his perfection. It was built on his brokenness, made whole by grace. It was built on his failures, transformed by love. It was built on his weaknesses, empowered by the Spirit of God. And perhaps that's the most encouraging truth of all. If God could use a man like Peter, with all his flaws and failures, then He can use any of us. This is the inspiring and humbling life of Peter. Inspiring because it shows us what God can do through an ordinary person who says yes to Him. Humbling because it reminds us that we don't have to be perfect to be used by God. We just have to be willing. We just have to keep getting back up. We just have to keep saying yes, even when we're not sure we're qualified for what he's asking us to do. After his miraculous escape from prison and the overwhelming events at Cornelius's house, Peter found himself at a crossroads that would define not just his own ministry, but the very nature of the church itself. You see, the keys to the kingdom that Jesus had given him were now fully in use, and the doors were swinging wide open in ways that Peter himself was still learning to understand. The years following his escape from Herod's prison were marked by a tension that Peter had never quite experienced before. On one hand, he was witnessing the most extraordinary expansion of the gospel message that the world had ever seen. On the other hand, he was grappling with questions that cut to the very heart of everything he thought he knew about God's people and God's plan. It was during this period that Peter embarked on what would become one of the most significant missionary journeys of his life, though it's often overshadowed by Paul's more famous travels. Accompanied by his wife, Peter set out to strengthen the churches that had been established throughout Asia Minor. This wasn't just a casual visit to check on how things were going. This was a deliberate, strategic effort to fortify the faith of believers who were facing increasing persecution and confusion. The journey took them through regions that are now modern-day Turkey, through places like Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, and Bithynia. These were areas where the gospel had taken root, but where the young Christian communities were struggling with questions that seemed to multiply faster than answers could be provided. Who exactly could be called a Christian? What did it mean to follow Jesus in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to their message? How should they live as followers of Christ while still being citizens of Rome? But perhaps the most pressing question of all was this: what happens when the very foundations of your faith are challenged not by outsiders, but by people within your own community who claim to speak for God? It was in Antioch that Peter encountered this challenge in its most personal and painful form. Antioch had always held a special place in Peter's heart. It was there that followers of Jesus were first called Christians. It was there that he had served as a leader in the early days after his escape from Jerusalem. It was there that he had seen Jews and Gentiles worshipping together in a way that seemed to perfectly embody the vision that Jesus had given them. But when certain men arrived from Jerusalem claiming to speak with the authority of James and the Apostolic Council, everything began to unravel. These men brought with them a message that cut like a knife through the unity that had been so carefully built. They insisted that Gentile converts needed to be circumcised and follow Jewish law if they truly wanted to be part of God's people. Now Peter knew better. He had been there at the Jerusalem Council. He had been the one to stand up and declare that God had shown no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, giving the Holy Spirit to both. He had been the one to argue that they should not burden the Gentiles with a yoke that even the Jewish people had struggled to bear. But when these men arrived, something inside Peter faltered. Perhaps it was the weight of his past, the memory of all the times he had failed when it mattered most. Perhaps it was the political pressure of trying to maintain unity with the Jerusalem church. Perhaps it was simply the old Peter, the impulsive fisherman who still lived somewhere deep inside, making decisions based on fear rather than faith. Whatever the reason, Peter began to withdraw from eating with the Gentile believers. At first, it might have seemed like a small thing, a minor adjustment to avoid conflict. But the ripple effects were devastating. Other Jewish believers began to follow Peter's example. Even Barnabas, who had been such a champion of the Gentile mission, was swept along by what Paul would later call their hypocrisy. The word Paul uses there is important. Hypocrisy doesn't just mean being false or fake. In the original Greek, it refers to the behavior of an actor, someone who puts on a mask and pretends to be someone they're not. Paul was saying that Peter wasn't being true to who he really was, wasn't being true to what he actually believed about the gospel. When Paul confronted Peter publicly about this, it must have been one of the most humbling moments of Peter's life. Here was this younger apostle, someone who had once persecuted the church, standing up in front of everyone and calling out the man who had been Jesus's closest disciple. Paul's words were sharp and direct. If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? But here's what's remarkable about this moment. Peter didn't defend himself. He didn't pull rank or appeal to his authority as one of the original 12. He didn't storm off or try to justify his actions. Instead, he listened. He received the correction. He repented. This wasn't the first time Peter had faced correction, of course. He had been rebuked by Jesus himself on more than one occasion. But this was different. This was public correction from a peer, and it came at a time when Peter's leadership was being watched and evaluated by churches throughout the known world. The way Peter handled this moment reveals something profound about the man he had become. The old Peter, the impulsive fisherman who drew his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, might have fought back. The old Peter, who had argued with Jesus about washing his feet, might have defended his position. But this Peter, the Peter who had been broken and restored by the risen Christ, understood something deeper about leadership and about grace. He understood that true leadership sometimes means admitting when you're wrong. He understood that the gospel is bigger than any one person's reputation. He understood that the unity of the church was more important than his own pride. This incident in Antioch marked a turning point in Peter's ministry. From this point forward, we see a Peter who is even more committed to the inclusion of all people in the gospel message. We see a Peter who is willing to be vulnerable, willing to admit his mistakes, willing to learn from others even when it's painful. The years that followed were marked by increasing persecution throughout the Roman Empire. The early tolerance that had allowed the church to grow relatively unimpeded was giving way to suspicion and hostility. Emperor Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome, disrupting Christian communities throughout the empire. Local officials were becoming more aggressive in their treatment of believers. The social pressure to conform to Roman religious practices was intensifying. It was in this context that Peter began to write what would become his first letter to the scattered believers throughout Asia Minor. These weren't just casual greetings or theological treatises. These were words of encouragement and instruction to people who were facing real persecution, real suffering, real questions about whether their faith was worth the cost they were paying. Peter's first letter reveals a man who had learned to see suffering not as a sign of God's absence, but as a pathway to spiritual maturity. He writes about suffering as a Christian with the authority of someone who had experienced it firsthand. He had been beaten, imprisoned, and threatened. He had watched friends die for their faith. He had seen the church scattered and regrouped, attacked and rebuilt. But more than that, Peter writes about suffering with the wisdom of someone who had learned to see it through the lens of Christ's own suffering. The man who had once tried to prevent Jesus from going to the cross now writes about following in Jesus' footsteps, even when those footsteps lead through pain and persecution. This is the Peter who tells his readers that they should not be surprised by the fiery trial that is testing them, as though something strange were happening to them. This is the Peter who encourages them to rejoice insofar as they share Christ's sufferings, so that they may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. These aren't just pretty words written from a comfortable distance. These are hard-won insights from a man who had learned to find hope in the midst of hopelessness, to find strength in the midst of weakness, to find joy in the midst of sorrow. As Peter's ministry continued to expand and mature, he found himself increasingly drawn back to Rome. The great city represented something unique in the ancient world. It was the center of power, the heart of the empire that had dominated his entire life. It was also by this time home to one of the largest and most influential Christian communities in the world. But Rome also represented danger in a way that perhaps no other city did. The emperor's power was absolute there. The pressure to conform to Roman religious practices was most intense there. The persecution of Christians, when it came, would be most severe there. Peter's decision to return to Rome was not made lightly. He knew the risks. He had already escaped from prison once, and he understood that he might not be so fortunate a second time. But he also understood that the gospel demanded everything from those who proclaimed it. He understood that true discipleship meant being willing to follow Jesus wherever he led, even if that path led to suffering and death. The Rome that Peter returned to was a city in transition. Nero had come to power, and with him came a new level of extravagance and cruelty that would define his reign. The Christian community there was growing, but it was also facing new challenges and new threats. One of the most significant of these threats came from a familiar source, Simon Magus, the sorcerer whom Peter had encountered years earlier in Samaria. Simon had apparently made his way to Rome and was teaching a form of Christianity that was so distorted it was barely recognizable as the faith that Peter had devoted his life to proclaiming. Simon's teachings were seductive in their sophistication. He claimed to be a manifestation of God himself, come to earth to reveal divine mysteries to those who were spiritually mature enough to receive them. He taught that the material world was evil, that Jesus couldn't really have been God because he had a physical body, that salvation came through secret knowledge rather than through faith in Christ. For Peter, this wasn't just a theological disagreement. This was a direct assault on everything he had witnessed and experienced. He had seen Jesus in the flesh. He had watched him eat and drink and sleep. He had seen him suffer and die and rise again. The idea that Jesus was somehow less than fully human was not just wrong, it was a denial of the very foundation of the gospel. The conflict between Peter and Simon Magus in Rome became more than just a debate between two religious teachers. It became a battle for the soul of the Roman Church, a struggle to determine what Christianity would become in the heart of the empire. Peter's response to this challenge reveals the depth of his spiritual maturity. Rather than engaging in public debates or trying to match Simon's spectacular claims, Peter focused on the simple, consistent proclamation of the gospel. He preached Christ crucified and risen. He emphasized the importance of love, humility, and service. He demonstrated through his own life what it meant to follow Jesus. This approach required enormous patience and faith. Simon's teachings were flashy and appealing to people who wanted to feel special, who wanted to believe that they had access to secret knowledge that others didn't possess. Peter's message was harder to swallow. It required admitting that you were a sinner in need of salvation. It required surrendering your life to someone else's authority. It required being willing to suffer for the sake of truth. But Peter had learned something through all his years of following Jesus. The truth doesn't need to be dressed up or made more appealing. The truth has its own power, its own ability to transform hearts and lives. His job wasn't to make the gospel more attractive. His job was to proclaim it faithfully and let the Holy Spirit do the work of conviction and conversion. As the persecution in Rome intensified, Peter found himself writing his second letter, this time addressing not just the scattered believers in Asia Minor, but the broader church that was facing unprecedented challenges. This letter has a different tone from his first. Where the first letter was primarily about enduring suffering with hope, the second letter is more urgent, more concerned with the immediate threats facing the church. Peter writes about false teachers who are infiltrating the church, about people who are twisting the scriptures to their own destruction, about the importance of growing in the knowledge of Jesus Christ. But running through all of these concerns is a deeper theme, the certainty of Jesus' return and the need to live in light of that reality. This wasn't just theological speculation for Peter, this was personal. He knew that his own time was running short. He could see the storm clouds gathering around the Roman Church. He could sense that the relatively peaceful period the church had enjoyed was coming to an end. In his second letter, Peter writes with the urgency of a man who knows he may not have another opportunity to speak to the church. He reminds his readers of the things he has witnessed, the experiences he has had with Jesus, the truths he has learned through decades of following Christ. He wants to make sure that after his departure, they will be able to recall these things and hold fast to them. The Peter who writes these letters is not the same man who first met Jesus by the Sea of Galilee. The impulsive fisherman has been transformed into a mature leader who understands the weight of responsibility he carries. The man who once denied knowing Jesus has become someone who is willing to die for the privilege of proclaiming his name. But perhaps most remarkably, the Peter who writes these letters is a man who has learned to see his own failures and weaknesses, not as disqualifications from service, but as qualifications for ministry. He writes to people who are struggling with their faith, who are facing persecution, who are tempted to give up, not as someone who has never experienced those things, but as someone who has walked that path and found grace sufficient for every need. This is the Peter who can write about the importance of humility because he has learned it through humiliation. This is the Peter who can write about the power of God's grace because he has experienced it in his own moments of greatest failure. This is the Peter who can write about the hope that we have in Christ because he has seen that hope proven reliable even in the darkest circumstances. As Peter's ministry in Rome continued and the persecution intensified, he must have thought often about the words Jesus had spoken to him by the Sea of Galilee after his resurrection. "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." Jesus had said this to show by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. For years, Peter had lived with the knowledge that his life would end in martyrdom. But rather than making him timid or cautious, this knowledge seemed to give him a kind of freedom. He knew how his story would end, and that knowledge allowed him to live boldly in the present. The Peter who faced his final days in Rome was a man who had learned to see his life not as his own possession, but as a gift to be offered back to the God who had given it to him. He was a man who had learned that true greatness comes not from avoiding suffering, but from finding meaning and purpose in the midst of it. This was the Peter who would face Nero's persecution with courage. This was the Peter who would encourage his fellow believers even as they faced torture and death. This was the Peter who would demonstrate through his own martyrdom that the gospel he had proclaimed was worth dying for. But that final chapter of Peter's story was still to come. For now, he continued to serve, to teach, to encourage, and to build up the church that Jesus had entrusted to his care. He continued to be the rock upon which Christ was building his church, not because he was perfect, but because he had learned to let God's strength be made perfect in his weakness. Peter's story ultimately teaches us that our greatest weakness can become our greatest strength when surrendered to God's transforming power. Throughout his journey, we've seen how his impulsiveness led to both spectacular failures and remarkable breakthroughs. His denial of Christ in the courtyard became the very foundation for his passionate proclamation on Pentecost. His tendency to speak before thinking evolved into bold prophetic declaration that opened doors across the known world. The broken fisherman who wept bitterly after betraying his Lord became the rock upon which Christ built his church. Peter's restoration wasn't just personal healing, it was prophetic preparation for the suffering he would endure. When he finally faced his own crucifixion, he understood that his weakness had been the very thing God used to display divine strength. This is the profound mystery of Peter's life and ours. God doesn't call us despite our brokenness. He calls us because of it. Our scars become testimonies, our failures become foundations, and our weakness becomes the canvas upon which God paints his glory. Peter's legacy reminds us that transformation isn't about perfection, it's about surrendering our imperfections to the one who makes all things new. The fisherman who once sank beneath the waves learned to walk on water, not through his own strength, but through unwavering trust in the one who called him out of the boat. This is the invitation extended to each of us today.